Hey, do you have to deal with the CBAM topic? I just talked to Nick from CarbonChain, who previously did financial auditing and now is focusing on the CBAM topic. So if you were looking for a deep dive on CBAM, this is going to be your episode. Enjoy. Hey, Nick, thank you so much for taking the time. For those of the listeners that don't know you yet, can you give us a quick introduction about yourself and what do you do right now?
Yeah, sure. Happy to say hi, everyone. My name is Nick Ogilvie. I'm a customer success manager here at CarbonChain, based in London in the UK. I primarily work with businesses importing steel, aluminium, fertilizer, so CBAM goods, shock there, into the EU. And obviously, we work with a number of commodities traders, manufacturers of CBAM goods, and then broader businesses who have CBAM reporting obligations as a result of some of their import and export activities. Maybe for a bit more context, so CarbonChain is a carbon accounting software provider, and we've been around for 5 years now, primarily working with commodities traders in the aluminium and steel space, as well as the energy, oil and gas, and agriculture side. We are generally kind of a product carbon footprinting provider. We also do corporate carbon footprint work. And as a result, specializing in this commodity sector, CBAM's kind of swept us up and got us involved on that side as well, actually kind of clashing directly with the work we're doing on the carbon accounting side. For my background, I'm an engineer and an accountant. I started my career out in Shanghai, working in the solar and battery storage industry, doing a lot of kind of quality assurance and manufacturing audit. And then I came back to London, did a financial accounting qualification with PwC, and specialized in a lot of work around climate risk in the audit. Worked quite heavily with asset managers and a lot of kind of SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, EU taxonomy regulation. They're well steeped in EU legislation and the challenges that kind of brings for businesses. So, CBAM was another acronym to kind of add to the list,
Nice.
but has been a really interesting kind of challenge because the kind of the optimistic side, if it goes well, is really exciting. So I'm sure we can dive into that a bit more. But yeah, a little bit of background on myself.
Yeah, super interesting. So where did the sustainability interest come from you? You said that you worked in solar before and then with PwC, you also work with sustainability reporting. Do you know where this came from or did this just develop?
Yeah, great question. So I did a general engineering degree at Durham University in the UK, and that gave me a great opportunity to kind of explore different avenues within engineering. And in my final year, I did a renewable energy focus, so power systems focused, sort of master's degree, an integrated master's in the UK. And during that degree, the Durham Energy Institute sponsored me to go to a conference run by an organization called Student Energy. And this organization brings together students from around the world. And I managed to go to two, actually. I went to one in Indonesia and another one in Mexico, and met an incredible group of students really passionate about the climate and how we could bring kind of the student voice together and get more students involved in the energy industry. And as a result, ever since attending those events, I've been obsessed and fascinated by the energy industry and particularly, how we can think about the climate impact of various different sectors. And so from my personal experience, I've always had that climate lens whenever I take on new opportunities, which has been awesome. And I've been super kind of privileged to have the opportunity to pick up that niche quite early on in my career and be able to then run with it. And yeah, actually, we then ended up, I was almost part of the organizing committee for the London event, which happened in 2019 now, through the Imperial College. And we worked really closely with a number of organizations to run that event. But, the energy sector and particularly, how we can build and develop more renewable power has always been something that I've been really passionate about. And kind of comes back to how we think about, carbon accounting and actually measuring the impact of various activities that we're involved in. So actually, when I left PwC, I went to a business called Net Purpose, where we worked doing impact measurement for asset managers, particularly with listed impact funds, which is, if you're into the impact world, is relatively controversial. But if we were looking at enterprise impact, and it was fine. And so a lot of the kind of thinking around how we can measure and report sustainability was something that I've been really interested and passionate about. And critically, when I think about, where are the big sectors and sources of emissions, and clearly that's what the EU have done in their Green Deal when they think about CBAM and carbon leakage. Obviously, some of the main challenges sit within places like the aluminium, the steel, and then fertilizer, hydrogen energy, cement sectors. But critically, from my perspective, like where there are significant opportunities for decarbonisation sit within the aluminium and the steel sector. And so at CarbonChain, the work we do on product carbon footprinting is quite tangible in that sense, because you're able to genuinely identify lower carbon suppliers. And so when you think about CBAM, when you think about sustainability linked loans for traders, when you think about businesses trying to gain green premiums, if those exist right now, which one would argue they don't, on material, you can genuinely have a pretty tangible impact on the emissions associated with an end product if you're doing a kind of cradle to grave or to gate product carbon footprint, which is what CarbonChain were doing. And so really bringing the data to life around the carbon intensity of products that you are trading or using to produce your end products and selling into customers. And so there's almost a drive that's been happening from producers trying to kind of advertise their lower carbon credentials, but also more and more, particularly with CSRD, you have this drive from larger businesses in the EU who recognize that they have a scope 3 reporting obligation. They have these incredible net zero obligations as well. And therefore they need transparency into their supply chains. And so they need to know what is the carbon intensity of the product that they're buying. And that's very, it's not new, but most businesses today think about emissions and they go, oh, scope 1 and 2, scope 3, that's too hard. Whereas when you think about product carbon accounting, you need to know what your fuel consumption, your electricity consumption is. But actually, in product carbon footprinting under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there is no scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 categorization there. And so, there's a real learning curve, which has been fascinating, but also, businesses recognizing today that they can win win new business, be competitive in RFPs if they have good data on the carbon intensity of their products. And CBAM as a tool behind, the acceleration of that recognition, particularly for businesses overseas who are trying to gain access to the EU market, has been a really interesting and kind of powerful change that we've certainly seen over the past few months, at least. People, think that CBAM has been around, the concept's been around for a while, right? The original kind of consultations and legislations coming out, earlier in this decade, but then, the implementing legislation coming out in August, giving businesses very little time to turn it around. And so, we're still on a pretty strong learning curve when it comes to CBAM implementation at the moment, for sure.
Very cool. I always like to hear other stories where people from a passion for sustainability get into the area and then somehow try to do some impact and do some good. And then at the end, it ends with sustainability reporting, because this might not be the first topic that looks super sexy where everybody wants to work. But at the end of the day, those are the things where you can actually have impact and bring things forward, and where a lot of work is needed right now.
And maybe just to add to that, have an audit background, so financial accounting is the fundamental underpinning of the capitalist system that we exist in today. And if we can effectively implement carbon pricing across all underlying products that are moving around the world, then you have a much more sort of tangible system that you're able to influence through policies and through mechanisms to drive down emissions reductions. And until we have that really strong measurement systems in place, what can't be measured can't be managed. And so we will see this kind of significant shift towards much better quality data when it comes to making these sustainability decisions. And so that's where it's really exciting with CBAM, where the ambition is just enormous. And if we do get to a point where we are genuinely relying on installation data to price how we to inform how we price the carbon intensity of material, then decisions can be made. Because today, one can argue, particularly under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that the use of averages and the use of estimations definitely hinder the way in which businesses can make truly informed decisions around their low carbon procurement. So it's a fascinating point in time.
No, I definitely agree. You just touched on the CBAM topic. I would be curious to hear a little bit more about like how is CarbonChain focusing on CBAM right now? What are the challenges that you are faced with? Like, what is the day-to-day that you're doing with the CBAM regulation?
Sure. So as I mentioned, CarbonChain's background is in performing carbon accounting for traders in the aluminium, steel, energy sectors, and as a result, we were on this side of the fence doing full product carbon footprints. So we were looking at the full emissions portfolio of a material, where it was produced, where the underlying ores were mined. For aluminium, for example, we're looking back to the bauxite mines, the transport, the alumina smelting. I'm sorry, the alumina refining, the aluminium smelting, all of the underlying shipping legs, the end use of the product, if we knew that, like how it was reaching the customers, the full emissions footprint, which you would do if you were doing greenhouse gas protocol aligned carbon footprinting, which is what all of the kind of globally recognized reporting standards sort of rely on. The GHG protocol is considered the gold standard when it comes to carbon accounting. And so, when we were doing all this analysis for these companies and CBAM, as a regulation, we saw it coming. We were watching it. Obviously, with the implementing regulation coming in so late, it was very difficult to know exactly, what the requirements were going to be on the CBAM. And so then from August, that point onwards, you really had a much clearer picture around the exact requirements of the implementing, the transitional period that we were in. And the key kind of piece was that, from a carbon accounting perspective, CBAM is significantly simpler than doing a full-scale greenhouse gas protocol aligned carbon footprint. And so, but also was difficult because of the fact that you have to be using actual data. So, in the greenhouse gas protocol, you can make estimates, you can make assumptions. When it comes to CBAM, the fact that they remove a lot of the your ability to use assumptions, you have to use actual data from the installations or the production sites that are manufacturing these CBAM goods. But you're reliant on having asset level data, and in the greenhouse gas protocol, that is the kind of best data set you can get, direct from the supplier. So it's this very interesting scenario we have where actually, getting asset level data and complementing that with all of the kind of upstream analysis that we do to find, source material is going to kind of become this really powerful combined data set. So today, when we work with customers that previously didn't have asset level data on specific smelters in the aluminium side, specific steel mills, and on the steel side, we now, as we start to get this CBAM data, have this incredible opportunity to providing very high quality product carbon footprints using this asset level data from specific sites. Now, obviously, there are varying degrees of whether or not the data is ready, varying degrees of willingness of mills and smelters to share this data, and obviously, keeping this data secure and safe is kind of the key part of our agreement with the companies that we work with. But recognizing the fact that there is this incredible opportunity to get to a point where we have really high asset level data from these points within the supply chain is really interesting. The key challenge, is that actually a lot of businesses had set themselves the target of doing full product carbon footprints. And so CBAM is a little bit of a spanner in the works, because actually they were like, well, we've designed this process to capture product carbon footprint data. Now we need to tailor it. We need to readjust it to be able to comply with the CBAM specific methodologies. So either the calculation or measurement-based approaches. We need to get specific data from suppliers. We can't just rely on estimates. The measurement approaches are slightly different. Or, for example, we can exclude certain things. We can aggregate to a much higher level. With CBAM, you can aggregate to commodity codes. Whereas when you're doing product carbon footprints, you really want to be doing it at the product level. Commodity code is great from a customer's perspective to be able to manage that system, but actually products within a commodity code can vary significantly. And so if taking the simplest CBAM approach you want of aggregating everything under the same commodity code and just allocating emissions at a very high level, then actually your underlying product carbon footprints of the underlying products, you can have 50, 100, if not more products under the same commodity code with wildly different carbon footprints. But that's not how CBAM is currently designed. It's currently designed to facilitate easy reporting, which, we're all on board with, because of the fact that the scale of CBAM today is just immense, and the kind of reporting requirement for these installations is also, challenging if you've never done any form of carbon accounting before. But I think, maybe if we take the steel sector as an example, like steel mills are pretty advanced. Like they're all tracking their carbon intensity. Everyone knows roughly blast furnace, electric arc furnace intensities. Like all these sites have a very good handle, mainly because they're very large sources of emissions. And so they're probably captured under domestic carbon pricing schemes already. Critically, when you go down the chain, so if you're a steel rod producer, or if you're a steel screw producer, as long as you can get precursor data, and that's the kind of key challenge in many cases. So getting the actual input material, carbon intensity of the input material, because that is 90+% of the carbon intensity of the end products you have. On that 80-20 threshold, you need that data. The key challenge is really, recognizing the fact that you know how much electricity you consume because you've got a bill for it. And you also know how much kind of, direct emissions you produce from any of the source emissions like natural gas combustion or fuel combustion, because you also have a bill for it. So when it comes to kind of looking at installations producing complex goods, the carbon accounting side there initially is quite intimidating. But when you recognize that it's only static machinery, as long as you can get that information from your suppliers, which obviously is the key challenge, and we'll touch on that later, the actual carbon accounting side of it is relatively straightforward for these complex goods manufacturers. So yeah, hopefully that kind of touched on some of the sort of key challenges there with regards to the carbon accounting side.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like, I guess the whole aspect of like gathering the data and like managing the data is, first of all, very intimidating, and then also like the most difficult challenge, I would assume, for companies to like cope with all of that. How about the time aspect? Because with all of the CZD related topic, I feel like the companies I talk to, they're always under some time pressure. And I think the next deadline is coming up this summer. So how does the timeline for CBAM look?
Yeah, so I mean, for importers, obviously they're currently in their sort of quarterly reporting structure. Most importers now have done 2 declarations. When I say most, I mean the ones that have actually been involved in CBAM. Obviously, we saw from some of the announcements from various NCAs that very few businesses actually made a CBAM declaration when they were supposed to. So, they will be getting letters to kind of speed up their reporting process and obviously risk that fine piece. From a timelines perspective, for declarants, the key date that's in their minds is, in my mind, is the end of October. Because critically, the 31st of July is the end of the use of default values. So from that point onwards, you can't use default values, which means that for the declaration for the next declaration, the third report that has covering Q2 imported material, you can use default values. It's just then for anything imported in Q3, with the deadline of the 31st of October, you have to be using primary data for that declaration. So that is the deadline that most people are concerned around. And that's rightly so, because effectively you have 5 months now, or, just under 6 months to initiate a supplier engagement strategy that will get you that primary data that you need in order to make your declaration without failing to comply with that requirement to be using primary data. And I think one of the misunderstood pieces on primary data, and by primary data, we just mean actual data from an installation, right? So, today you use the default values provided by the commission, and primary data means you actually have to talk to your supplier and get them to give you the carbon intensity data that they need to calculate themselves. And that needs to then be what you use, in line with the CBAM requirements. They need to do those calculations, and you use that for the declaration. The 80-20 rule goes around quite a lot, which is to do with the fact that for complex goods, 80% of the embedded emissions are able to have to rely on primary data, but 20% can rely on default values. And I think that the kind of one of the misconceptions there, I believe, is that that doesn't mean that as a declarant, 80% of your embedded emissions that you report can be using primary, and then the other 20 can be using estimate. It means that for every single installation that you've bought goods from, you have to get primary data from all of them. But then from within an installation, 20% of the embedded emissions of the end products can use default values. And so that piece is one of the critical pieces where you can't just ignore certain suppliers. You have to engage all of them. And what that means is that it's a great opportunity now for recognizing that, so you have to go and speak to all your suppliers. This is an opportunity for you to test an effective supplier engagement strategy, particularly when you come to think about things like CSRD, scope 3 reporting, and more broadly sending a message around, if you have a net zero strategy, you are going to need tangible data to inform that strategy. And therefore, when you go out to speak to your suppliers, CBAM should be a key component where there is that regulatory kind of stick where you need this data. But actually, as part of a longer term engagement with those suppliers, being able to offer them training or offer them support of doing product carbon footprinting, completing the kind of carbon data challenge, and making sure that, today you're asking for CBAM, tomorrow you're going to be asking for a product carbon footprint, the day after you're going to be asking to look more deeply into things like CSDDD, various other, sustainability regulations that you are going to need information from them, not just around carbon. And so in some cases, particularly with the clients we're working with today, we're really trying to get them to recognize the fact that, yes, we're doing an engagement to obtain CBAM data, but critically to enable you to make better decisions going forward based on the carbon intensity of the suppliers that you're currently working with. You should be looking to get product carbon footprint data. In the steel industry, you should be looking to try and get environmental product declaration data, so EPD data, and really using this opportunity as a strong way to engage with suppliers when it comes to carbon-related reporting, carbon-related regulation that you have to comply with. Because you can't make well-informed carbon-related decisions associated with your supply chain without really high-quality data on these production processes and the kind of broader implications around a full product carbon footprint compared with just the CBAM data calculations you see today. So that's really where we, as carbon accounting experts, our focus at scale is how do we support carbon accounting for your underlying suppliers? Because if we can do that, and if we can get them to the point at which they can give you the best quality data possible, so you can inform, okay, in 5-10 years time, this is how much my CBAM costs are going to sit at. And if they do start to expand the scope of CBAM with regards to the carbon accounting methodologies, here's what it would look like under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. From a CSRD reporting perspective, we need to include scope 3 because we are a metals trader, or we are importing, we're importing metals with high carbon intensity. We import fertilizer, we import, material that has a high carbon intensity. So when we look at our emissions as a business, the products that we buy under in scope 3 are the material section of our CSRD reporting piece. So when we do our materiality assessment, that's what we come out with as that's 95% of the emissions of our business. And therefore, that is a critical kind of recognition that a lot of the kind of commodities sector, commodities traders, but also manufacturers of steel products, aluminium products need to recognize, is that the majority of the emissions that they as a business are touching sit within their supply chain. And so, from our perspective, data quality sits at the core of CBAM, of CSRD when it comes to carbon reporting. And that's really where, as a business, we've focused our CBAM efforts around, is educating suppliers on carbon accounting to enable the clients that we work with today, to enable them to make more informed decisions when it comes to really factoring in the economics of carbon pricing. Because CBAM, the phase in of the certificates, in line with the phase out of the ETS allowances, is pretty gradual. But as soon as we hit the 2030s, like the costs and the premiums on material, obviously if you're a trader, you don't really mind because you're a trader, you just manage the prices like that. But if you're a manufacturer and you're consuming a significant volume of steel and aluminium, then these effective premiums, or what we suspect will just be the discounts on higher carbon products, they're going to start to have a significant impact on the decisions and the procurement actions that you take as a business.
Yeah, I understand. I also believe that getting the data from the supplier, that is one of the main challenges. And I can imagine that setting up a system for that is super complicated and demands a lot of work. I would be curious, because for me, it's difficult to find information on that. What if companies are not able to meet the timelines and are not able to get the required data in time? Is it already determined what is going to happen then?
If I had an answer for that, then I think our consulting side would be in great business. But right now, the only thing you can say is like the legislation says that you'll be penalized for misreporting at between 10 and 50 euros per ton of CO2, right? And obviously those penalties go up. And the key challenge there is then, failure to obtain data and having that kind of mark against you will risk you obtaining the authorized declarant status from 2025 onwards from a CBAM perspective, which would essentially remove, your license to operate as a business if you're reliant on importing these materials into the EU. So, from a risk perspective, obviously, doing as much as possible to engage your supply chain, provide them as much facilitation as possible with carbon accounting as a concept, how you can kind of provide them with the minimum viable solution to get their CBAM reporting over the line so that they can do everything they need to do to be able to prove to you that they have gone to the full extent of trying to comply with CBAM. And I think, obviously there's lots of rumors. We saw the ICC sharing a kind of letter with the European Commission around, where they see the key challenges of CBAM. And obviously the key piece there is around, default values and obtaining primary data from installations or from operators of installations. And so I guess, there's a number of challenges here. The first one is the way the EU ETS operates today is failure to report, even 1 ton of CO2 results in almost an immediate penalty. And so it's very strict, very rigorous when it comes to the way in which they manage how they kind of orchestrate the ETS. So if they are to really, truly have an effective solution for the carbon leakage challenge that they call out, then they need to have the same level of kind of rigor and verification that goes on within the CBAM legislation, which is a monumental task if you think of how many businesses are impacted and how many businesses are producing, are in some part of the supply chain, be that distributors, finished good manufacturers, original material providers, all these different businesses moving product from A to B that eventually then get to the EU. Tracking that data is an immense challenge. So it'll be super interesting to see like the approach that the Commission think about when it comes to potentially looking to change the way in which they manage the kind of phase out of default values, if they do. Because obviously, as I said, like they won't be able to maintain that level playing field if they start to remove the requirement for actual data to be used in those CBAM declarations from the declarants. The other challenge, obviously, is it's legislation. So it will take them time to amend the legislation and get that passed. We've obviously got elections coming up in the EU, which might move the kind of dial slightly with regards to the strength and kind of conviction that they have around legislation on sustainability pieces. And yeah, I think the last one, I guess, is slightly separate. I mean, obviously, the UK CBAM is currently under consultation, and there's a kind of request for feedback out at the moment. And one of the interesting pieces about the UK CBAM and the way they've approached that is that effectively they've just said, default values are going to be in place for 4 years, and then they will make a decision as to what they do next. And what they're thinking there is, if we have a penalizing default value, it incentivizes businesses to get actual data because it will reduce the penalties or not the penalties, but it will reduce the costs they have to pay or that adjustment they have to pay on import into the UK. And so effectively, the EU could look to do something similar where they say, the default values remain, but if you can obtain primary data, you're almost guaranteed to pay less of an adjustment when you import material into the EU. So, the approach that the Commission take to change the way in which they, sort of administer this sort of default data piece is going to be interesting. I think that the key takeaway that we give customers is, if you are thinking long term about your strategy, getting this data is going to be critical to be able to enable you to make these informed decisions around carbon pricing, but also, again, to the point at which they, you want this data because it will reduce the costs associated with importing. Maybe the last piece is around like the de minimis. Obviously, 150 euros is incredibly low, and so this captures a vast range of businesses that, quite frankly, have potentially a very low, very kind of like very minimal impact when it comes to climate and total emissions. They're maybe just moving spare parts around, and sometimes they get caught up in moving them into the EU. And I think some of the expansions that they could make around the de minimis thresholds, be that a weight threshold or a value threshold, or increasing the value threshold, or setting an emissions threshold, might help with these sorts of businesses, where actually, we were targeting the kind of significant importers of material into the EU, but actually maybe that when they take a look and over the course of the transitional period, or maybe look at the past 3 or 4 reports that go in at the start of next year, they might look to change how the de minimis works to really make sure that they are capturing, of the 50% captured from an emissions perspective, they're still capturing 90% of that, even if they increase the threshold by a relatively substantial margin to, avoid the poor guys that import screws and nuts and bolts for their, for their chairs or what have you that they're trying to get set up for their event, right? So it's a tricky piece, but lots of unknowns in the CBAM kind of regulatory world at the moment.
Yeah. Sounds super interesting and also very complicated at the same time because the regulations are still changing a bit, and there's a lot of data to like consider and a lot of tasks for the companies to do. So I'm really curious to see how this will develop in the future. Now, maybe changing to a little bit more of a positive outlook. What are like tips and recommendations that you would give to companies in order to cope with all of this complexity and to approach this and to, maybe just have a better start into all of this?
Yeah, so I think I've touched a number of these pieces. I think my point around product carbon footprinting being the kind of T, like CBAM is a reporting obligation that you have to meet. But if you're going to go and speak to every single one of your suppliers on carbon data, then you should speak to them about product carbon footprinting and how it fits within EU CBAM. So if you do a product carbon footprint, there are components of that are really that feed directly into your CBAM reporting. The other pieces around obtaining actual data from precursor suppliers and just preparing it in a format that is compliant with the EU CBAM reporting requirements, a monitoring methodology, for example, as well. I would really think holistically around what are you going to use this carbon data for that you can get from your suppliers if this was your one opportunity to go and speak with them and engage with them. And that leads into really the supplier engagement strategy. How are you thinking about this process? There are a number of different people within your business that should be involved: sustainability, procurement, tax, legal team, finance team as well. Potentially, if you're thinking about projects 10 years down the line that are going to be using a significant amount of steel, aluminium, how are you factoring in CBAM costs? Whether you're going to, when it comes to your procurement decisions, do your purchasing, sourcing, procurement teams know what the cost implications are for buying from high carbon suppliers? And how can you really make sure that everyone within the business is aware of these implications? And then, if you are setting yourself up to do long-term imports from a specific supplier, could you think about today managing your exposure to CBAM certificate costs? Can you look to, start to potentially buy allowances at today's price for thinking about how you can manage hedging and exposure pieces there? And how does that all fit into CSRD and other EU regulation around carbon? So I think that's the key piece, and all really ties in together around, what are the economic implications of CBAM for your business? The other thing to maybe touch on is like CBAM's not going away anytime soon. We've already seen a sort of proliferation of other CBAMs for jurisdictions and countries where they have a high net import of these high carbon materials. The US, EU obviously has their has the EU CBAM we've been talking about, but the UK, Taiwan, Australia, Canada, these are all other countries where CBAMs are on the table right now. And so there's a lot of discussion and recognition that the concept of this carbon border adjustment and various other border carbon adjustments, they're not going away, and therefore they're really important piece around businesses and how they think about their sustainability strategies. Maybe just to touch on the US super quickly, the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, that's a really interesting piece of legislation where it's looking to benchmark domestic production. And then anyone importing from anywhere overseas, compared with domestic US production, you either pay a fee if your carbon intensity is higher, or you almost, you get a free pass if it's lower. So that's one other way of implementing a border adjustment mechanism. In the US, they also have the Clean Competition Act, where they're looking to do that kind of benchmarking exercise domestically. And so a lot of businesses in the US, who obviously historically, US has generally been a kind of laggard when it comes to climate regulation. But now, there is a recognition, particularly following the Inflation Reduction Act, that a lot of, the opportunity for decarbonizing domestic production is rapidly coming to the forefront. So, when they think about how do they protect that interest, when we think about the Foreign Pollution Fee Act and that sort of piece, if you're thinking about CBAM today, recognize that it's not just going to impact the EU, but there are going to be other jurisdictions where your business might operate in that are going to be impacted. But also critically, the flip side to that is that, today you may be buying from third countries as defined by the EU, which don't have an existing carbon pricing scheme. And that is also going to change quickly because places like Turkey, for example, and Serbia, big steel, aluminium producer of Turkey, for example, they're already thinking about how they can implement carbon pricing schemes because they recognize that they don't want all of that potential revenue that could be going to their, governments going to the EU's coffers because they don't have an existing emissions trading system in place. So very quickly, the wonder of CBAM is that it's driving changes in climate policy globally because people want to be able to retain a lot of that the carbon pricing revenue opportunities in those jurisdictions. So pretty exciting. Another piece to kind of think about in the broader piece on CBAM.
Yeah, that sounds super exciting. I'm very curious to see how the CBAM situation develops in then countries like Turkey, but also seeing like US, UK, EU. I think that's going to be really exciting to see how those different areas are going to react to that. Another question I'm getting asked quite a lot is for free templates and helpful material, because a lot of companies are trying to like make sense of it by themselves first and just trying to like get into it a little bit. And therefore, of course, any free material is super helpful. Do you know of any, or do you have any that you would like to share where you say this could be helpful to some companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, CarbonChain, have just launched a self-serve CBAM tool that any business, whether they are a declarant or an installation, can gain access to. Within this portal, you're able to firstly access this Learn module that we've developed. This contains a range of instructional videos, guidance, letter templates to request data from your your CBAM goods suppliers if you're a declarant, but also templates to request data from your precursor suppliers if you're an installation. We've got a range of monitoring methodologies for a variety of product sets, as well as some partially filled CBAM data communication templates to help you with that initial process. So if you would like to gain access to that, I think there'll be a link in the description below that you can use that. So hopefully that's a great kind of resource for businesses trying to quickly upskill with CBAM to meet that end of July and then end of October deadline as we start to see the phase out of the default values.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds super extensive and super helpful. So I will definitely make sure when you send me the link to put this into the show notes below so that people can just access that. And yeah, I think these were already the questions that I had prepared. So as long as you don't have anything else that I might have forgotten, I think, yeah, that would be all.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a blast. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much for taking the time.